Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Ray. I'm a detransition male, and today I want to talk about the argument that trans activists make that AGP is not real. Because you often see this from trans activists. They say that autogynephilia is not real. No trans woman ever develops their identity as a trans woman out of a paraphilic sexual orientation. Like they deny that sexuality has anything to do with the development of gender identity. They say that the sexuality and identity are two separate things, and that the sexuality and the identity, they're parallel tracks and they have no relation to each other. And whereas the theory of autogynephilia says that it is the sexuality that causes the identity. And there's so much evidence for this in the original research of like Blanchard and Bailey and all these people. But also, if you just look on Reddit every single day, there's a lots of people talking about how their gender identity as a woman, as a trans woman, has its roots in a fetish. So let's look at this thread on Reddit. So just a fetish or something else. Trigger warning: dysphoria, self-loathing, denial. Something I feel like I'm not a trans girl. I'm just a man with a fetish to turn into a woman because honestly, I don't think or act like a woman. I'm pretty masculine ish. I can pass as a man, but I don't feel like one. That I'm stuck as a boy, never able to grow up mentally. I had this thought when I wore panties and short shorts to bed. It felt so good that I just had to masturbate. Man, it feels wrong to do this. I don't know. I'm just looking for women who have similar experiences as mine. Okay, so clearly this is evidence of autogynephilia. This is the classic prototypical description of autogynephilia. It is a fetish or a paraphilic interest in turning into a woman. It is a fetishization of that transformation process. It is a fetishization, a attraction to being the other sex. It is a attraction to the idea of transformation. It is an attraction to the idea of embodying the opposite sex. Even though you are just a regular, masculine guy who is not an innately feminine, sissy boy who's been, gender nonconforming from like a very young age since like 3 or 4, which is the more homosexual type. Okay, let's see what the comments say. Do the comments acknowledge the reality of autogynephilia, or do they gaslight this person into thinking that they must be really trans? And I'm not saying that it's like one or the other. That if you have autogynephilia, you like can't be trans, because autogynephilia is a cause of trans identity. However, there's this common move to say that autogynephilia does not exist, that the fetishization is not a pathway into trans identity, which is just false because it so often is, and there's so much evidence for that. So this person says, okay, first off, deep breath. Doubt is perfectly normal with anything like this. And yes, quite a few women tend to get a hard on when they start to dress in the correct clothes. Sometimes the brain relates euphoria and arousal since they use the same part of the brain. Okay, so first off, correct clothes. What does it mean, correct clothes? Aren't trans activists always saying that clothes don't have gender? That, it's like, okay, so how can panties be correct clothes? That is gender essentialism. That is regressive. That is sort of saying that, clothing, that panties are inherently feminine or something like this, which is like bullshit. So anyway, that is kind of crazy, but it's the fact that the clothes are stereotypically associated with, femininity, but also it's not just like clothing. It's the fact that for AGPs in this stage of the paraphilia, the interest is usually in highly sexualized aspects of femininity, like stockings, high heels, bras, things like this that are very stereotypical, panties and stuff like this. So that is how it starts off, as in this, sort of sexualized fantasy of what it means to be a quote unquote sexy woman or whatever. You don't want to like this fetish never starts off with like a fetish for, wearing like really boring ratty clothes as like a woman. It always starts off with like panties and stockings and bras, and then it sort of escalates until eventually you want to do the full-blown transformation, and then you start wearing like regular clothes of like a regular woman. Welcome to the guilt-ridden joy that is a euphoria boner. No, you're not alone in that. Okay, so this is what they euphemistically describe of. This is how they describe autogynephilia. They describe it as a euphoria boner. And, but the homosexual transsexuals don't experience this. The transsexuals who are exclusively attracted to men don't have euphoria boners, and they never talk about this. They never acknowledge this concept of like being confused about whether it's a fetish or not. That is a phenomenon that is exclusive to the trans women who are not exclusively into men. This exactly held me back from transitioning for at least 15 years. I thought it was just a fetish, but brain is just bad at telling you the difference between a good feeling about your gender and being horny. You probably experienced a euphoria boner as well, and it's sadly as common as confusing. Okay, so it's not that the brain is bad at it because the homosexual transsexuals don't experience this. This confusion about horniness and gender and fetish and boners and all this stuff, that is a phenomenon that is unique to the trans women, the AGPs who are not exclusively attracted to men. And then, of course, they always post this article, and every one of these threads, they always link to the same article. And this is how the propaganda spreads. This is how the denial of the reality of autogynephilia spreads. Okay, someone else says, speaking for myself. Oh, wait. Yeah, let's see. Someone else says here, I'm 46 and just cracked the egg in April. I fantasized and masturbated to feminization and sissification porn every day since I was 15, thinking about it all the time. I thought I was a pervert and told no one for so long. I have a wonderful wife of 12 years. We have always been through so much together. We were into some kinky sex, BDSM and stuff. I always had a mistress fantasy too. One day we just happened to Google about dysphoria and everything in my brain just clicked. It was like a switch just flipped. I don't even think about or fantasize about this stuff anymore. Okay, and then someone else says, the fetish argument has been officially and exhaustively debunked. Okay, so how can the fetish argument be debunked when literally right above it, you have someone saying that they had a fetish for feminization for 30 years prior to the development of their trans identification? The theory of autogynephilia says that for males who are not exclusively attracted to women, the development of a trans identity starts off in the fetishization. That is the fetish argument. Now, they want to say, well, it's not just a fetish. Well, autogynephilia also doesn't say that it's just a fetish. The fetish gets elaborated on, it gets escalated, it progresses, the identity develops out of the fetish. But the autogynephilic theory says that the roots of it have to do with this feminization fetish. It has to do with a sexual attraction. It comes out of sexuality. Whereas the trans activists, they want to separate the sexuality from the gender identity. They want to say that it is the repressed gender identity that is the cause of the sexuality. Yeah, this person says sexuality often ends up as a psychological junk drawer for whatever it is we don't want to think about but can't ignore. For many trans women, if there's no way to present as a woman in reality, the truth of our identity pushes its way in through sexual fantasy. No, it is the other way around. It is the sexual fantasy that causes the development of the identity, not the identity that causes the development of the sexual fantasy. Because in all these cases, you have these people who are like, yeah, I thought it was a fetish for 15 years, or I've had this feminization kink for like 15 for 30 years. So the kink comes first, the fetish comes first, and then the elaboration of the development of the identity as a woman comes later. And often that comes from a habituation to the stimulus, and you sort of need more and more and more, so it gets kind of escalated, so you are no longer satisfied with like just dipping your toes in like a little bit. You sort of need a greater and greater dopamine hit in order to experience sexual pleasure. So you keep pushing the escalation, and particularly when you get exposed to the sissy porn, the trans porn, you get exposed to these like trans communities. You get you become aware of all these trans people everywhere, and that sort of plants your idea that you can have your fantasy of turning into a woman that can become a reality, and that is very tempting, and that is very desirable for these AGPs. So it can't be that this is debunked, that the fetish argument has been debunked, when every single day there are so many people talking about how the fetish is the roots of their gender dysphoria. It is where it all begins. And that is what the autogynephilia theory says, is that this has its roots in sexuality. You can't separate sexuality from identity, even though over time, after transition and normalization and habituation, and also by going on the hormones and kind of nuking your libido and killing your libido, or dampening down your libido, you sort of sublimate those desires into a romantic idealization of the identity. It's like being in love with like your partner for so many years that you sort of like no longer have those sort of like erotic, like super intoxicating feelings of like being high because you're so turned on. It's sort of like becomes more romantic and idealized, or whatever. But it's like this fantasy of turning into a woman, this idealization. And you sort of like fall in love with yourself. And this person says it's perfectly natural to be turned on by yourself. Don't be ashamed of it. It is actually not. I mean, it is natural in a way, but it's also like it's like not normal sexuality. Normal sexuality is other oriented. It is like you're primarily turned on by other people. That is what drives your arousal. Whereas the autogynephilia, they're more internally oriented. They're more autosexual. Like the AGP often has much more elaborate masturbation lives. They have much more elaborate autosexual masturbation lives, such that they really, they're really into themselves. They like, they put on their bra and panties and they like, stare at themselves in the mirror, and sort of develop like this elaborate autosexual sex life, this elaborate masturbation life. And that is not as normal as regular heterosexuality. And to say that this is like, oh, this is like female sexuality, that females experience this. No, normal females don't have a fetish about, transformation into a woman. A fetish that's based on a fantasy about transformation into something that you're not is not the same thing as being a woman, already being female, and then just like, thinking that you're hot when you look in the mirror, because the male is being turned on by the fantasy of being something they're not. Whereas female sexuality, like you are female, you're not fantasizing about transforming into female because you are female. The females who are, whereas the autogynephile, the male is fantasizing about transformation into something they're not. They're fantasizing about transforming into being a female, whereas normal female sexuality is not based on that fantasy about transformation. So that's the key difference, is about, because a female is already female. They're not fantasizing about transforming into a female. So that's the difference. And it's only gender ideology that says that they're equivalent, because they say that, well, the trans woman is female. So they're not fantasizing about being something they're not, because they are female. And why are they female? Because they have the gender identity. And it's this like gender identity that's like been there since like birth or whatever. Even though there's clear evidence that the gender identity develops after the elaboration of the paraphilic fetishization. So the paraphilia comes first, the sexuality comes first, and the identity stuff comes later. The gender identity is not the cause of the sexuality. The sexuality is the cause of the gender identity. So I just wanted to talk about this because so often the trans activists deny that autogynephilia exists, despite clear evidence that it does, that it is a accurate description of the development of gender dysphoria in the trans women who are not exclusively attracted to men. So yeah, the trans activists want to deny this because it's not as like palatable as a social narrative. The autogynephiles need a socially acceptable narrative in order to convince the public that that it's normal for them to live this out in the real world. Because if that take that AGP who'd been having a feminization and kink for 30 years, if he went into his workplace and identified as like trans and told his coworkers, hey, I'm trans, I'm going to start dressing in women's clothing, I use she her pronouns, I'm going to use the women's bathroom, if they knew that he had a fetishization for feminization and sissification for the past 30 years, do you think that they would be equally accepting, like, oh yeah, you're a real woman, your womanhood is perfectly valid, you're just as much as a woman as any female, like your womanhood is like perfectly just the same as like cis womanhood, and there's no difference between the two, and yet I have to be transphobic to think there's any differences between cis women and trans women, and they're just the same, they're perfectly the same. No. If people were more aware about autogynephilia and about how some all these AGPs, they have a whole life history of having a feminization kink, they would have a different perspective about this theory, this gender ideological theory, that they're just women on the inside, and that they're no different from any other regular female woman. But the gender ideology narrative needs this idea of gender identity, of brain body mismatch, of it's born this way, it's like a medical condition, that sexuality has nothing to do with it, because that narrative is necessary for the social acceptance of this at a mass scale socially, such that this becomes acceptable. It becomes, you have President Biden, the highest echelons of our society, have all these nonprofits and NGOs and corporations, and the like New York Times, and like the like academia and all these things, like in the democratic left progressive circles of polite society, like this has all become way more acceptable because there's a new narrative that diminishes the realities, which is that for all these AGPs, it has its origins in sexuality. That is not as socially palatable, but the truth needs to win out. We need to hear the truth, because the truth is a good thing. The truth will set you free. So we need not be in denial of this. I think that the public needs to hear about the truth of autogynephilia, because when you learn about the truth of autogynephilia, it destroys this ideological narrative that these trans women are just the same as cis women. They just were born in the wrong body or whatever. No, the development of an identity as a woman based on the fact that you had a feminization kink for the past 30 years is different than developing an identity as a woman because you are female, born female, lived female, grew up your whole life female. That is a different aspect. That those are two separate things. They're not the same. Trans women are not females. They're not women. They are males who have a sexuality that causes them to develop this transformation, a kink, this desire to be the other sex, to embody the other sex, to transform into something that you're not, in order to satisfy the sexuality. That is what it is, and you see evidence of this everywhere on Reddit. Yet it is suppressed because of a political motivation, because they know deep down that if people knew the truth about the fact that they've had a feminization kink for the past 30 years, that the whole like oh, you're a valid woman, your womanhood is valid, blah blah blah, you're a real woman, trans women are real women, that narrative would no longer be socially acceptable. They would sort of acknowledge that AGP is a distinct phenomenon and that these are feminized males who have their identity rooted in sexuality. And that would allow therapists and doctors to give a more accurate therapeutic understanding such that people can understand themselves. Because when you understand yourself, the truth will set you free. Self knowledge and introspective acknowledgement of reality is healthier than the delusional narrative that you were born a woman. You were not born a woman. You were born male. You are male. You are a man. And then you developed the sexuality that caused you to develop this identity. Um, and I'm not saying that like transition and HRT can't be a viable treatment for the sexuality, but I think we need to acknowledge that fundamentally it is a treatment for a sexuality that causes problems in your life such that you need this in order to feel happy or whatever. But I think when we reorient discussion around this, but the truth of autogynephilia, it's just going to be lead to better therapeutic accuracy in dealing with with this phenomenon, and people would just be honest. We need honesty in the conversation, because all this obfuscation, this denial, this ideology, it is distorting the truth. But people really knew the truth about this, we'd be having a different conversation in the public about whether or not trans women are women, in like, trans women, belong on female sports, they belong in single sex lockers and changing rooms and all this stuff, that they belong like in female prisons and all this stuff, like, and AGP does not belong in the female prison. So okay, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Take care. Bye bye.